Job is incredible. It's not only a powerful book of scripture, it's probably one of the best works of literature that came out of the ancient world. It's somehow both dramatic and subtle, beautiful and unsettling, faith-affirming, and faith-challenging. But if all you know about Job comes from what you learn in Sunday school, you probably think this kind of praise is a little over the top. Job, as commonly read, comes off a little bit like a simplistic fairy tale about a man who is generically good even when times get really tough and is eventually rewarded for it. Kind of like Cinderella. It's not a bad story, certainly, but is it really so unparalleled? If we don't appreciate Job, it may be simply because we haven't really read it. At least in Sunday school, we don't read most of it. We generally read the first 2 chapters and the last chapter, with maybe a few verses taken out of context from the middle. Now for some books, reading the beginning and the end may be enough to get the gist of what it's about, but that is not the case with Job. It's like if you only watch the black and white scenes from The Wizard of Oz. You missed the movie, and that's how we're reading Job. So today, I want to lay the groundwork for you to go and actually read Job yourself. We'll go over the structure and then briefly summarize the main points. There's no way I can do this justice, so you have to promise me you're going to read Job yourself, okay? One more point before we begin. If you really want to understand Job, you should probably explore different translations. Job is very poetic and has a lot of unique words and phrases that make it notorious as the most difficult book in the Bible to translate. Different translators approach it very differently. Some are as literal as possible, others try to capture the feel of the poetry, while others focus on expressing the arguments in the dialogue. Reading different translations is probably the best way to get a complete idea of what Job is all about. Okay, let's start with genre. You kind of have to start here because the book of Job actually contains 2 different genres that are juxtaposed in order to create a sharp contrast. The beginning and end of the book, really the prologue and epilogue, are written in prose. The best way to describe the genre would probably be to call it a fairy tale. The opening phrase, "There once was a man," is even a pretty good equivalent to the modern "once upon a time." Everything in between the prologue and epilogue, that's like 95% of the verses, is written in poetry. The genre of the poem is what scholars call a wisdom dialogue. Job, his friends, and eventually God himself participate in a discussion. The arguments are complex, the poetry is beautiful, and the overall feeling is really sincere and intense. So what's going on here? Why this weird genre-hopping structure? Well, many scholars believe that the author of Job took a fairy tale that was already old and well-known at the time, and then inserted a complex original poem right in the middle to challenge the assumptions of the fairy tale, and by extension, the religious culture that told the fairy tale. One Latter-day Saint scholar made a modern analogy that I thought was apt. Imagine if someone today rewrote the story of Cinderella exactly as we know it from Disney, but right in the middle they included a huge philosophic dialogue written in verse, with Cinderella defying her stepsisters and godmother by insisting that she wants more from life than just marrying some rich guy. So what is Job trying to say? Let's recap the prose frame really quickly, and then we can jump into the poem. Basically, Job is a righteous man who has been blessed with tremendous wealth and a big family. Meanwhile, in heaven, all the sons of God or divine beings are presenting themselves to God and making their reports. One of these beings is Hasatan. Sidebar, readers today generally assume this Hasatan character is the devil as we traditionally think of him. In this context, however, that may not be what the text is going for. Hasatan, literally the Satan or the accuser, seems to be more of a title for some figure in God's heavenly court. That would explain why he's making his report with the other divine beings. It's probably best to think of him as the chief prosecutor or spy master, the guy in charge of rooting out those who are evil and insubordinate. Probably not too popular, but not necessarily the embodiment of evil. While receiving Hasatan's report, God asks him what he thinks about Job, a man who is apparently completely righteous and loyal to God. As per his job, Hasatan suggests that Job might only act righteous because he's so blessed and protected by God. Take away this protection, he argues, and Job would instantly betray God. To test this, God eventually allows Hasatan to take Job's wealth, kill his children, ruin his health, and leave him with only his nagging wife. Sometimes these old fairy tales are a little misogynistic. Job, however, remains stubbornly loyal to God, even as he suffers immensely. 3 of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come and silently sit and mourn with him for 7 days. And that's where the prose suddenly stops and the poetic dialogue kicks in. But if we fast forward back to where the prose picks up in the last chapter, as we often do, we see that Job has passed the test, and God rewards him with twice the wealth he had before and 10 new children. And they all lived happily ever after. Now, let's get to this poem. The first thing to understand is that the poetic body of this work is very different from the prosaic frame. The style is different, the arguments are different, and even though we're dealing with the same characters, they seem again very different. Job's friends aren't going to sit quietly with him, and Job is no longer the patient sufferer singing praises to the Lord who giveth and taketh away. Maybe the author is deliberately breaking continuity, or maybe this is just the result of 7 days of silently brooding. I think both readings lead to interesting insights. Either way, these characters have got something to say. The first part of the poem is a dialogue between Job and his 3 friends. This dialogue can be divided into 3 cycles. In every cycle, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar each alternate with Job to present their arguments. Each time a character speaks, they build on and respond to the previous arguments, so the dialogue progresses and becomes more and more intense. If you boil down the arguments, it comes down to this. Job insists that it's only just to punish the guilty. So because Job isn't guilty, God must be unjust. Job's friends also believe it's only just to punish the guilty, but they argue that since God is just, Job must be guilty. Now that summary is crazy simplistic. It completely misses the beauty of the poetry and the deeply human turmoil of the characters. It's a profound exploration of the experience of suffering, the way we try to make sense of suffering, the pitfalls we run into as we try to comfort sufferers, the impact all this has on our relationships, and so much more. Please go read it. The dialogue is all building up to a theophany, when God makes his appearance to answer Job's accusations. But before we get there, there are a few interruptions. The first is a hymn about wisdom, right at the end of the dialogues and right before Job makes his final speech. It's not really clear if this is supposed to be a part of the dialogue or if it's legitimately just an interlude in the poem. A lot of scholars think it may have been added to the text sometime later. The second interruption is a speech by Elihu. This character Elihu appears really abruptly in the text right after Job's final speech. He not only condemns Job, but he also condemns Job's friends for failing to adequately defend God against Job. He insists that God is perfectly just and that it is not our place to question him. And then Elihu disappears from the story as abruptly as he appeared. Again, many scholars think that Elihu's speech was probably added later to the book of Job, probably by scandalized readers who, just like Elihu, felt frustrated with Job and his friends. Once Elihu disappears, we get the moment we've all been waiting for. The voice of the Lord issues out of the whirlwind to answer Job's accusations. And the Lord's answer is complicated. There's no way I can do justice to God's answer now. That deserves its own episode, so we'll talk about that next time. Right now, the important thing to understand is that the stakes are as high as they come. The book of Job doesn't question God's existence. It does something even more radical. It questions God's work. Job isn't upset because God isn't there, he's upset because God is there, but apparently he's too incompetent or immoral to do things right. Job's friends think that Job is either lying about his own innocence or missing something else, but they haven't really been able to clarify what that something else might be. At this point, someone doing his scripture should be feeling a little confused or conflicted. Next time, we'll see if any meaningful answer can emerge from this stupor of thought.